The fields of Flanders were not always soaked in mud and blood. Once they rolled like soft green oceans, dotted with sheep and children's laughter. There was a village called Rousseauville, small and forgotten, built from stone and time, wrapped around a little church with a bell that only tolled for weddings or storms. It was here, in a home nestled behind a bakery, that Céleste Moreau came of age, not with ceremony, but with the steady rhythm of kneading dough beside her mother and sending warm loaves to the neighbors before dawn. She had hands made for care and a mind shaped like a keyhole, always turning toward mysterious little ones at first, like the name of the new boy from Lille, or why the chimney swallowed birds in spring. But beneath that curiosity lay something firmer, quieter, a will to see more than her world would allow. In the same village, some 40 kilometers west, a Senegalese boy named Mamadou Diallo marched with the other conscripts. He did not come of his own choosing. The French had taken his father's millet and his older brother's arms, and now they had taken him 2 cents across the sea with a rifle in his hand and a uniform that fit no one quite right. In the port of Marseille, he had tasted snow for the first time and watched men stare through him like he was not quite real. They called him Tirel, a word that meant shooter, though he had never fired a bullet before the training camp in Lyon. Still, he stood upright, not because he loved France, but because standing upright was the only thing he could control. And across the water in England, where the chimneys never stopped puffing and the rain whispered secrets along the cobbled streets, a girl named Elsie Wynne was training not to be seen. Elsie had freckles like falling ash and eyes that never settled. She had been plucked from her post as a switchboard assistant when someone noticed how well she remembered voices, how she could mimic a Belgian accent with a lilt of grief or reply in perfect Hochdeutsch with clipped, obedient vowels. They did not tell her much, only that she would carry words across borders, and that if caught, she must not be remembered. By the end of the summer of 1914, she had crossed into France under a false name, riding in the back of an ambulance with a satchel of paper so thin it could hide behind the lining of a glove. The world was shifting, but it did not shatter all at once. The war came like a slow rip in the fabric of daily life, bread rationed, fathers summoned, church bells silenced. The train station grew swollen with men in blue coats and kisses cut short. Rousseauville emptied until only the old, the young, and the invisible remained. Céleste stayed, not because she was brave, but because her mother's lungs had begun to fail and the bakery needed tending. She would rise before the birds and press dough with aching wrists, listening to the distant thunder of cannon fire creeping closer with each week. She watched strange soldiers pass through, Canadians with their long vowels, Moroccans with their bright eyes, Indian sepoys clutching amulets against the cold. All were marching east. None ever returned west. Mad OU slept in tents so cold they cracked at the seams, his skin burning beneath wool meant for Parisian winters. They trained by shouting numbers in French and running until their legs forgot the jungle. His comrades died not in battle, but from coughs that never left their lungs. Still, he held on. He found warmth in singing songs from home, in rapping, his mother's scarf around his wrist, in caring for a pigeon named Diara, assigned to his company. The birds were quicker than couriers and less likely to die. Mamadou fed Diara crumbs of biscuit and whispered Wolof into her feathers. She was the only soul he trusted, and Elsie, threading her way through occupied towns, learned the art of silence. She delivered code on invisible ink scratched into recipe cards, slipped messages into the seams of socks, memorized entire conversations between German officers and French collaborators. She posed as a nurse, a schoolteacher, even a grieving sister. Once, she spoke to a soldier with bandaged eyes, asking gently about troop movements. When he began to cry, she held his hand until sleep took him. She felt like a ghost already, walking through lives she would never live. The storm had not yet peaked, but its edges had touched them all, Celeste with her quiet defiance, Mamadou with his weary resolve, Elsie with her fragile masks. The war had not asked them for permission. It had come anyway, eroding the edges of the world they knew, drawing them towards something far larger, far darker than anything they had ever imagined. And so they waited each in their own way for the moment the war would call their names louder than their pasts could hold. It was in the early days of 1915 that the world began to change its shape entirely, not with sudden fire, but with the quiet disappearance of what had always been there. The bakery's windows in Rousseauville were blackened, not from soot or smoke, but from silence. Celeste still rose before dawn, still shaped the dough as her mother had taught her, but the warmth was gone. Her mother's breath had grown thinner by the day, and one morning it stopped entirely. Celeste did not cry. She sat beside the bed and folded the sheet over the body, as if tucking her mother in for the last long sleep. Outside, a new sound echoed through the streets. Not bells, not laughter, but boots. Foreign boots. The Germans had arrived. They did not storm the village with violence. They came instead with forms and rifles, with clipped commands and half smiles. They took over the church and turned it into a command post. They requisitioned homes, one by one. Celeste's bakery was left untouched, not out of mercy, but usefulness. The soldiers needed bread, and she was the only one left who could make it, so she baked for them. Wordlessly, she never looked them in the eye. She kept her face like stone and her ears open. Sometimes they spoke in hushed tones near the back table. Sometimes they dropped letters, receipts, maps, and Celeste, with her quiet hands, began to collect them. Far from the village, Mamadou's unit had been sent to the front near Ypres, to a stretch of earth where trees no longer grew and the sky hung like an iron curtain. The trench was no more than a gash in the ground, oozing water and fear. His first day, Mamadou watched a boy no older than 16 fall face first into the mud and never rise. No one screamed. They only stepped over him, as if the ground had always claimed its share. He tried to write home, but the words felt thin, too small for what he had seen, so he stopped writing. He fed Diarra with trembling hands and kept his letters in his head. When the order came to charge, Mamadou did not move at first. His legs did not understand the command, but the whistle blew, and the men rose like ghosts, stumbling over the top into a world that belonged to no one. Bullets cut through the air like whispers, fast and cruel. Mamadou ran, not toward the enemy, but away from the cold, away from the trench, away from the endless grey. He didn't remember how he made it back alive, only that he could still feel Diarra beneath his coat, her heart beating faster than his own. And in the north, Elsie had reached a crossroads. The network she worked with, codenamed La Rose Noire, was collapsing. One by one, her contacts were disappearing, some arrested, some never heard from again. She learned not to speak until she was sure no walls had ears. She wore mourning black now, so she could blend with the widows and not be questioned when she cried. The grief she faked began to harden into something real, not for anyone she knew, but for the weight of all she could not stop. It was in Roubaix that she met Celeste for the first time. A message had been hidden in a sack of flour delivered by a passing trader. Baker's daughter knows the names. It read. It meant nothing at first, till a contact named Armand whispered that a girl in Rousseauville had memorized the schedules of the German trains. So Elsie came, disguised as a Red Cross volunteer, bringing bread to rural towns. Celeste didn't speak when she arrived. She simply looked into Elsie's eyes and nodded once. That was how it began, the quiet resistance of two women who had nothing but their grief and their memory. Celeste learned to bake secrets into loaves, little slips of paper tucked into hollow crusts. Elsie carried them across the countryside, past checkpoints and searchlights, always smiling, always grieving. They did not speak of trust. There was no time, only the work and the fear and the slow understanding that even silence could be an act of war. Mamadou's world shrank to a stretch of mud no wider than a churchyard. He stopped sleeping. When he closed his eyes, he heard screams that never ended. The other men began to lose their minds, some laughing into the night, some eating mud, some begging invisible gods to end it. He held Diarra close and spoke to her in Wolof, not caring who heard. "You are home," he would whisper. "You are not here." She was the last thing in his life that did not reek of death. Then one evening, a shell landed near the trench and blew apart the earth like it was paper. Mamadou awoke, covered in blood that was not his. Diarra was gone. He dug through the rubble with bare hands until he found her, her wing broken, eyes wide. She was still breathing, barely. He held her to his chest and sobbed deep, broken sobs that tore the cold from his lungs. No one stopped him. They were all crying too. The war had not yet ended anyone's story, but it had begun to erase the pieces that made them human. Celeste no longer dreamed. Elsie no longer feared death. Mamadou no longer felt his feet when he walked. And still, every day, the cannons grew louder. Every day, the world asked a little more of what was left. There is a place where the wind forgets how to blow and the sky lowers its eyes, where the land no longer breathes and mud replaces memory. That place was the front dot by the winter of 1915. Mamadou's boots had become extensions of his skin, wet-rotted, splitting with each step. His hands were blistered and blackened, his breath always visible in the damp cold that never lifted, even in sleep. If it could be called sleep, men didn't rest anymore. They folded into corners like broken furniture propped against walls, of sandbags and wire, trying to remember how to forget. The trench was not just mud and blooded, was time itself, stretched so thin it cracked. There was no past, no future, only hours marked by rations, fire, and the dead. Rats were kings there. They fed on what the earth refused to bury, dragging bits of men into corners like war trophies. Mamadou watched one gnaw the soft flesh of a boy's face. The boy had no name Mamadou could recall, just a number on a tag now washed. Clean by rain. Each day brought new orders: dig, wait, fire, advance, retreat, repeat. The war did not want their lives quickly. It wanted them slowly, inch by inch. It wanted their minds first. The screams that echoed at night weren't always from the wounded. Some came from within, the mind turning against itself, breaking like a bone under pressure. There were men who clawed at their own faces, convinced there were spiders under their skin. One sergeant wandered into no man's land, naked and singing. Mamadou never saw him again. Letters from home arrived like ghosts. Sometimes they were real, folded and smudged, smelling faintly of soap or wood smoke. Sometimes they were allowed by men who had received nothing, trying to remember what love sounded like. Mamadou never spoke of his village. It had become too distant, a dream he no longer trusted. He thought of Diara, now healed but too weak to fly. She perched near his head at night, the only warmth he knew. She was his last familiar heartbeat. In a world of strangers, far behind the lines, Celeste felt the weight too, though her war had no trenches. Hers was a different rot, slower, but no less brutal. The Germans had become part of the village now, wearing civility-like, ill-fitting jackets. The commander of the garrison, a man named Fischer, would tip his hat when he passed her, sometimes even ask politely for more loaves. He was always smiling. Celeste had learned to smile back, barely. She had learned how to nod, how to play small, how to speak just enough to pass. Each day more soldiers came. Each week more trains arrived. Celeste watched the patterns. She memorized insignias. She learned which units stayed for days and which vanished by morning. And at night, in the darkness of her empty home, she inked the details in tiny, slanted letters and baked them into bread, then waited for Elsie to return. Elsie came less often now. The journey had grown dangerous. 2 women from her network had been caught last month, one hanged. The other paraded through the town before being sent to a prison. No one returned from. Elsie's face was sharper now, her eyes always scanning. But she came anyway, cloaked in grief, masked as a nurse, hands gentle even as she reached for secrets. Celeste never asked where the messages went. She didn't need to. The war fed on knowledge as much as bullets. Every schedule shared, every location mapped, was a wound in the enemy's skin. They never called it friendship, but when they stood together, there was something between them, a silence that felt less lonely. Celeste once brushed Elsie's hand by accident and didn't pull away. They stood like that for a moment, 2 women made of absence, holding the smallest thread of human contact before the world called them back to their masks. And all the while, Mamadou marched and dug and waited. His unit was now less than half its size. Replacements came from Algeria, Indochina, Madagascar, men from across the empire, fighting for soil that was never theirs. They spoke in different tongues but shared the same look in their eyes, a hollow kind of waiting. The French officers called them brave, but the men knew better. They were not brave. They were trapped. One morning, the shelling began at dawn and did not stop. For 7 hours, the sky tore open. The ground shook like something alive. Mamadou held Diara in his coat and pressed himself against the wall of the trench, praying not for life, but for stillness. When the order came to advance, they rose again, half men in torn coats, screaming not out of courage, but panic. He ran. The mud grabbed at his boots. The sky was on fire. Around him, men fell like dominoes. And then something struck him hard, hot, tearing through the side of his leg. He collapsed, unable to move. The world became a ringing void. When he woke, he was in a field hospital. The cot beneath him was soaked. His leg had been wrapped, but the pain was distant now, like thunder rolling on the edge of memory. Diara was gone. He called for her with dry lips, but no one answered. He turned his head and saw only rows of broken men boulders that breathed but no longer spoke. The trench was behind him, but part of him had been buried there, standing. They say war turns boys into men, but what it truly does is quieter. Crueler, it makes people forget who they were before it began. When Mamadou awoke each morning in the hospital near Amiens, he no longer knew which day it was, nor cared. The cat beneath him had the smell of rust and old sweat, and the gauze around his thigh was stained from inside out. The wound had turned, they said. He might keep the leg, he might not. But that wasn't what haunted him. It was the silence, not the kind broken by gunfire or groans in the trenches, but the silence within, the kind that no longer remembered what his mother's voice sounded like, the kind that made him stare at his hands and not recognize them as his own. There was a boy across from him, French, pale and shaking, who had not spoken in 9 days. Every time the nurses tried to feed him, he wept. Not loudly, just little tears, like rain down a dirty window. No one told Mamadou what to do anymore. They barely looked at him. Black bodies were less of a surprise now. There were hundreds like him in the wards, scattered like seeds across a land that never asked them to bloom. He missed Diarra, he didn't even know if she had flown or been crushed. She had carried messages, like him, but she had been small enough to leave when she needed to. He stayed, not out of duty, out of lack of choice in Rousseauville. Celeste had reached the edge of herself. The resistance work was becoming dangerous. 2 German officers had begun to ask questions. One loitered in the bakery too long. Another began commenting on her eyes, her hair, her silence. Elsie had warned her. When a soldier smiles too much, it means they've already decided what they want. That week, Celeste began baking with a knife in her apron. She tucked it near the waistband, the handle warm against her stomach, and prayed. She would never have to touch it. The next message she received was different. It was not just a note to pass. It was an instruction, a name, a train, and a date. It was time to do more than observe. They were asking her to act Celeste, sat in her kitchen with the flour dust rising in thin clouds, the note trembling in her hand. The name belonged to an interpreter stationed nearby, a Frenchman who had been aiding the Germans with regional dialects. The note said he would be boarding a train to Lille in 3 days. The resistance wanted him delayed. A dead delay, not a broken one. It was the first time her work would not just move information, but blood. She was not ready, and yet who was? Elsie came 2 nights later. Her face was paler than usual, her gloves damp from the rain. Celeste let her in without a word, then lit a single candle. They sat at the kitchen table like they had done so many times before, but something hung between them now, something heavier than silence. Celeste placed the note on the table and did not look away. "I can't," she said finally. Elsie's jaw tightened, not in anger but fear. "If you can't," Elsie replied, "someone else will, but they'll do it louder, and people will suffer for that noise." Celeste stared down at her hands. They were covered in flour and guilt. "It's not who I am." Elsie leaned forward, her voice low and cracked. "It's not who any of us are, but it's what this war keeps asking." Outside, the wind scraped along the stone walls of the village. Inside, 2 women sat on either side of a war that neither had started, but both had been called to finish in their own way. Celeste wanted to cry, but tears felt like too much and too little at once. Instead, she stood, took the note, burned it in the kitchen stove. "I won't do it," she said again, "but I'll keep baking." Elsie nodded, though her eyes carried something wounded. Not disappointment, something worse. Understanding. The next week, the interpreter was found dead outside of Arros, shot twice. No one spoke of it. No questions were asked in the village. But after that, The Germans searched the bakery more often. Celeste slept with her boots on. Back in the hospital, Mamadou was discharged. The leg would heal, but the limp would stay. He was reassigned not home, not away, just elsewhere. A message runner, now, behind the lines. It was dangerous, yes, but at least he would be moving. He accepted without speaking. When he left, the boy who hadn't spoken still hadn't spoken. Mamadou touched his shoulder before going. The boy didn't react. Maybe none of them would ever again. That night, Mamadou dreamed he was flying. No uniform, no earth beneath him, just wind and sky. In the dream, he looked down and saw himself in a trench, younger, whole. And the pigeon was there too, flying beside him. But when he reached out, she vanished. The dream didn't end. It just drifted into darkness, slow as smoke. The war wasn't just in their lives anymore. It had taken root inside them, and each day it asked them, "Who are you now?" And each day they answered with their silence. Winter came like a closing fist. It did not snow in Rousseauville that year, only rained and rained and rained, until the very ground seemed to sigh beneath its weight. The bakery stayed open, though barely. Celeste had no fuel for the oven. Most days, no yeast, no salt, but she rose each morning anyway, and lit the coals with what she could find: broken crates, old furniture, sometimes the pages of old ledgers her father had kept. The bread was bitter, it didn't rise, but the soldiers still came, hungry not for taste but memory. The Germans were restless now. The war had shifted, and something had cracked at the edge of their confidence. Commanders barked orders more sharply. Paranoia pulsed under the surface of their glances. There had been sabotage along the rail lines, too precise, too many times. Someone, somewhere, was watching them too closely. And so suspicion grew like mold in the corners. Celeste noticed one soldier. A quiet boy with bad posture and a soft accents, maybe, who lingered after the others left. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He watched her hands as she kneaded, watched her eyes when she glanced toward the door. One day, he asked her name. She didn't answer. He didn't ask again, but something in his stare unsettled her. She began baking faster, breathing shallower, locking her door at night and not lighting the lantern. Elsie, meanwhile, had grown thinner bone and nerve, barely enough flesh to hide the scars forming inside. Her network had been reduced to whispers and walking ghosts. She traveled mostly alone now, disguises thinner each time. She was always grieving someone new. She hadn't laughed in months. When she met with Celeste, it was with hands trembling. From cold or hunger or fear, Celeste couldn't tell anymore. That night, in the back room of the bakery, Elsie told her, "They think I'm someone else." "What do you mean?" "There's a dossier," Elsie said. "My real name's not in it, but one of my faces is. They've seen me in Rouen, or think they have." Celeste lowered her eyes. "You should leave." "I will. Soon, but I need one more delivery moved before I disappear." It was not a request, nor was it a command, just the last breath of trust, passed like a candle between wind gusts. Celeste nodded. They embraced briefly, like two trees leaning together in storm. Winds. It was the first time they had touched since the day of the note, the day Celeste chose not to kill. They had said little about that since, but the silence had been full. Far from them, Mamadou now moved in shadows. He carried messages under the veil of night, from post to post, ducking between shell holes and shattered trees. His legs still dragged, but his mind moved quicker now. He knew how to listen for shells, knew the shift in the air before one landed. He knew how to crawl beneath barbed wire without catching his coat. He knew death, and he no longer feared it. But there was something else growing in him now. A question, an ember. Why? Why still fight? Why still carry letters for men who never saw him as one of their own? Why die for soil that had never tasted his name? One night, after delivering a satchel of orders to an artillery position, Mamadou sat by the fire with another runner, Moroccan named Idris, who chewed cloves and smiled like it hurt him. Idris spoke slowly, carefully, like a man whose truth had been punished before. "You ever think of running?" he asked Mamadou, to where Idris looked at the stars. Anywhere. They fell into silence. Then Idris reached into his coat and pulled something out. A tiny bundle. Wings. A pigeon. Alive. Smuggled her from an old post. They were going to kill her, said. They didn't need birds anymore. I kept her. Mamadou reached out. The pigeon blinked. His hand trembled. "What's her name?" he asked, voice breaking. Idris smiled. "Whatever you need it to be." Later that night, Mamadou wrote a message, not from command, from himself. He didn't sign it. Just 4 lines in French and Wolof, scratched on a scrap of paper. "We are dying in a war that is not ours. The black man bleeds, and no one looks. But we still see. We still remember." He tied it to the pigeon's leg and let her go just before dawn. She disappeared into the fog like a soul unchained. He never knew where she flew. Maybe nowhere. Maybe she fell. But in that moment, something in him lifted. Not hope, but defiance. Back in Rousseauville, the delivery cellist baked into the bread never reached its destination. A checkpoint intercepted it. Someone had spoken. Someone had seen. That same night, the bakery was searched. Rough hands overturned tables. A boot cracked the stove. A soldier with kind eyes held Celeste by the shoulders as the others tore her. World apart, they found nothing. But they had looked too closely. The soldier with the kind eyes did not let go right away. He studied her face, then said in German, softly, "I don't believe you're only a baker." Then he left. That night, Celeste burned everything. Every scrap, every record. The flour bin was empty. The bread turned to ash. That war had wings, yes. But sometimes it had eyes, to dot, and in the morning only smoke remained. The village of Rousseauville never officially burned. There was no headline, no declaration, no entry in the officer's report. But something died there all the same. The bakery, once filled with warmth and quiet resistance, now stood hollow. After the search, the soldiers stopped pretending. There were no more smiles, no more quiet civility. The Germans moved with urgency, with suspicion. A message had been intercepted near Arras, written in a mixture of Wolof and French. It had spoken of betrayal, of blood. It had travelled in the leg of a pigeon scent from a sector no pigeon should have escaped. They were hunting now. Not just soldiers, but shadows, whisperers. Women Celeste felt the change before it arrived. The quiet soldier with the Saxon eyes no longer visited the bakery. She didn't ask where he had gone. She already knew. And when a list was posted in the town square, with names underlined in red, she did not look directly at it, but she saw. Enough to know hers was there. She packed only what she could carry: a loaf of bread, a map, and the last note Elsie had given her, ink barely dried. "If you must go, go east. There's a convent near Cambrai. Tell them the storm eats its own." She left in the night, taking the narrow road that curved past the empty church. the one where she had once whispered her mother's name under the sound of tolling bells. Now the bells were gone. Only silence rang through the stones. The wind howled against her shawl as she walked for hours, hiding at dawn behind a collapsed barn. By midday, her feet were bleeding. By dusk, she arrived at the convent more stone than sanctuary, guarded by old gates and older eyes. She gave the phrase, trembling. The nun who opened the door looked into her face without a flicker of surprise. She simply stepped aside. Celeste did not ask how they knew. Some places do not need questions. Meanwhile, Mamadou was running again, orders in hand, across frozen fields lined with wire and bone. His leg, though healing, would never fully forget the bullet, but he moved fast, faster than most. It was not the commands that drove him now, nor the war. It was the idea that someone had read his message, that somewhere someone had felt what he felt and answered. He never knew who found. The pigeon never learned that the message had passed through hands in Arras, into a network of messengers who whispered it in broken French across latrines in camps, who folded it into letters sent home, who rewrote it on latrine walls, in barracks, in chalk on ammunition crates. We still see, we still remember. For a brief week, the phrase rippled like a secret hymn through the African units. Mamadou heard it once in the dark-haired old man near a fire, whispering it as a prayer. He didn't speak, he only listened. And for the first time, he felt not alone, but surrounded. But with every ripple comes a wave. A captain from Bordeaux confronted Mamadou, demanded answers. How had the words travelled? Who had written them? Mamadou did not speak. He simply stood. Still, the captain struck him. Once, twice, Mamadou fell, bled, but said nothing. That was the last time he bled for France. He was reassigned again farther from the front, to carry munitions to the rear batteries, a punishment disguised as protection. But he knew what it truly was. Exile, and elsewhere, far behind the lines, Elsie was no longer a ghost, but a hunted one. Her face was now on leaflets, her alias exposed. Her last contact had been tortured. The network was dissolving. She had one choice left: disappear completely or be made into an example. She went north, toward Belgium, where lines blurred and records were scarce. But in her coat she carried something precious, a folded slip of paper from Celeste, delivered before she fled. A message smuggled in the crust of a broken loaf. I am not afraid to burn, Elsie, but I want it to matter when I do. Elsie read it under moonlight, alone in a barn where soldiers had once sheltered. She folded it again, pressed it to her heart. Then, with shaking fingers, she inked a new message, her last, not for intelligence, not for strategy, just for truth. We are not your heroes. We are not your stories. We are your secrets, and we are still breathing. She gave it to a boy she met on the road, a mute child carrying kindling in a sack. She told him where to go, what to say, how to vanish if followed. He nodded, and then he walked into the fog, one more messenger in a world where voices no longer had bodies. The war had turned now. Whispers were no longer quiet enough. Fire had touched everything's city's skin, silence. The question was no longer if they would be caught, broken, or buried. The question was, would anything of them remain when the world turned cold again? Would anyone remember the pigeons that carried their cries, the flower that held their hope, the hands that never pulled triggers but bled anyway? Would they matter when the fire was done? The war ended not with a shout, but a sign November 11th, 1918, a date the world would engrave into stone, wrap in ribbons, and speak of in parades. But for those who had bled quietly, who had vanished without names, it did not feel like an end. It felt like being left behind. The guns fell silent, yes, but silence was never simple again. It was filled with echoes' faces that no longer returned to their bunks, doorways that remained unopened, pigeons that never found their way home. Mamadou was still alive. That should have been enough. He stood among the living as the armistice was declared, watching officers weep and cheer as if the noise could drown out what had already been lost. He did not join in. His hands were cracked and calloused, his coat stained with soil that would never be washed out. His name was never written on any honor roll. No medals were pinned to his chest. When the war ended, the officers sent him back to the south of France to await transport. They gave him half pay. No thank you, just passage. The train south was crowded with silence. Men sat side by side, staring at the blur of ruined fields and half-built graves. When Mamadou stepped off, there were no cheers, no flags, just wind and railway dust. He had carried France on his back for 4 years, and now he was a stranger again. He wandered the coast for weeks before finding work loading crates on the docks, lifting fish and salt and barrels of forgotten promises. His leg ached in the cold, but he never limped when others were looking. At night, he would walk to the edge of the port and look at the sky. He thought of Diara, his pigeon, still flying somewhere in his memory, wing outstretched, carrying a message no one would ever answer. Celeste survived the war in the convent, though she never returned to the bakery. By the time she did, Rousseauville was only a skeleton of what it once was. The church bell was gone. The bakery door had been boarded. She found the room where her mother died still as she left it, dust thick enough to silence even memory. She did not reopen the shop. She simply lit a candle, sat in the middle of the floor, and waited for the pain to rise and pass. Word reached her slowly over months that Elsie had been captured near Antwerp. Not executed, worse, disavowed. The British had denied knowledge of her, claimed she'd gone rogue. She had been sent to a prison hospital in the countryside, under a false name, barely breathing. No visitors, no funeral, but Celeste did not believe that story. She had known Elsie's eyes too well, known the way she looked at exits, always calculating. There was something in her too stubborn to die in chains, and so Celeste lit another candle, one for the dead, and one for the hidden. Sometimes, in the small hours, she heard footsteps outside the bakery. She never checked. She only listened. One morning, a letter arrived, no return, no seal, just her name in shaky ink. Inside, a single line, still breathing. She kept the paper folded under her apron. The war had ended, yes, but for those who had stitched their resistance into crusts of bread, who had carried truth on wings, who had whispered truth in dialects never printed in textbooks, the peace did not come like salvation. It came like a long walk back through ash, with no guarantee of firelight ahead. Mamadou eventually returned to Senegal. He arrived with fewer teeth, a limp, and no pension. No one in the village spoke of the war, not from shame, but from something older, something deeper. A wisdom that some griefs are too sacred to name. He planted trees. Every year he planted one more. He never told the children who he had been, or what he'd seen, but he taught them to raise pigeons, white ones, and told them they can always come home if you let them. The children never understood, but they listened. and high above, the sky still bore scars clouds like smoke, stars dimmed by the weight of what had passed. But sometimes, just before dawn, a single pigeon would cut through the quiet, alone, unmarked, flying not away, but towards something, not a battlefield, not a hero's grave, just a girl with flower on her hands, and a candle in the window.